The effect of the Quincy service was deepened by the official ceremony which afterwards took place in Faneuil Hall, when the boy was taken to hear his uncle, Edward Everett, deliver a eulogy. Like all Mr. Everett's orations, it was an admirable piece of oratory, such as only an admirable orator and scholar could create. Too good for a 10-year-old boy to appreciate at its value. But already the boy knew that the dead president could not be in it, and had even learned why he would have been out of place there. For knowledge was beginning to come fast. The shadow of the War of 1812 still hung over State Street. The shadow of the Civil War to come had already begun to darken Faneuil Hall. No rhetoric could have reconciled Mr. Everett's audience to his subject. How could he say there to an assemblage of Bostonians in the heart of mercantile Boston that the only distinctive mark of all the Adamsons since old Sam Adams's father 150 years before had been their inherited quarrel with State Street, which had again and again broken out into riot, bloodshed, personal feuds, foreign and civil war, wholesale banishments, and confiscations, until the history of Florence was hardly more turbulent than that of Boston. How could he whisper the word Hartford Convention before the men who had made it? What would have been said had he suggested the chance of secession and civil war? Thus, already at 10 years old, the boy found himself standing face to face with a dilemma that might have puzzled an early Christian. What was he? Where was he going? Even then he felt that something was wrong, but he concluded that it must be Boston. Quincy had always been right, for Quincy represented a moral principle, the principle of resistance to Boston. His Adams ancestors must have been right, since they were always hostile to State Street. If State Street was wrong, Quincy must be right. Turn the dilemma as he pleased, he still came back on the 18th century and the law of resistance, of truth, of duty, and of freedom. He was a 10-year-old priest and politician. He could under no circumstance have guessed what the next 50 years had in store, and no one could teach him, but sometimes, in his old age, he wondered, and could never decide, whether the most clear and certain knowledge would have helped him. Supposing he had seen a New York stock list of 1900 and had studied the statistics of railways, telegraphs, coal, and steel, would he have quitted his 18th century, his ancestral prejudices, his abstract ideals, his semi-clerical training, and the rest in order to perform an expiatory pilgrimage to State Street and ask for the fatted calf of his grandfather Brooks and a clerkship in the Suffolk Bank? 60 years afterwards, he was still unable to make up his mind. Each course had its advantages, but the material advantages, looking back, seemed to lie wholly in State Street. Peter Chardon Brooks, the other grandfather, died January 1st, 1849, bequeathing what was supposed to be the largest estate in Boston, about $2 million, to his 7 surviving children, 4 sons, Edward, Peter Chardon, Gorham, and Sidney, 3 daughters, Charlotte, married to Edward Everett, Anne, married to Nathaniel Frothingham, minister of the First Church, and Abigail Brown, born April 25, 1808, married September 3, 1829, to Charles Francis Adams, hardly a year older than herself. Their first child, born in 1830, was a daughter named Louisa Catherine, after her Johnson grandmother. The second was a son named John Quincy, after his president grandfather. The third took his father's name, Charles Francis, while the fourth, being of less account, was in a way given to his mother, who named him Henry Brooks, after a favorite brother just lost. More followed, but these, being younger, had nothing to do with the arduous process of educating. The Adams connection was singularly small in Boston, but the family of Brooks was singularly large and even brilliant, and almost wholly of clerical New England stock. One might have sought long in much larger and older societies for 3 brothers-in-law more distinguished or more scholarly than Edward Everett, Dr. Frothingham, and Mr. Adams. One might have sought equally long for 7 brothers-in-law, more unlike. No doubt they all bore more or less the stamp of Boston, or at least of Massachusetts Bay. But the shades of difference amounted to contrasts. Mr. Everett belonged to Boston hardly more than Mr. Adams. One of the most ambitious of Bostonians, he had broken bounds early in life by leaving the Unitarian pulpit to take a seat in Congress, where he had given valuable support to J.Q. Adams's administration. Support which, as a social consequence, led to the marriage of the president's son, Charles Francis, with Mr. Everett's youngest sister-in-law, Abigail Brooks. The wreck of parties which marked the reign of Andrew Jackson had interfered with many promising careers, that of Edward Everett among the rest, but he had risen with the Whig party to power, had gone as minister to England, and had returned to America with the halo of a European reputation, and undisputed rank second only to Daniel Webster as the orator and representative figure of Boston. The other brother-in-law, Dr. Frothingham, belonged to the same clerical school, though in manner rather less clerical of the two. Neither of them had much in common with Mr. Adams, who was a younger man, greatly biased by his father and by the inherited feud between Quincy and State Street. But personal relations were friendly as far as a boy could see, and the innumerable cousins went regularly to the First Church every Sunday in winter and slept through their uncle's sermons, without once thinking to ask what the sermons were supposed to mean for them. For 200 years, the First Church had seen the same little boys sleeping more or less soundly under the same or similar conditions, and dimly conscious of the same feuds. But the feuds had never ceased, and the boys had always grown up to inherit them. Those of the generation of 1812 had mostly disappeared in 1850. Death had cleared that score. The quarrels of John Adams and those of John Quincy Adams were no longer acutely personal. The game was considered as drawn, and Charles Francis Adams might then have taken his inherited rights of political leadership in succession to Mr. Webster and Mr. Everett, his seniors. Between him and State Street, the relation was more natural than between Edward Everett and State Street. But instead of doing so, Charles Francis Adams drew himself aloof and renewed the old war which had already lasted since 1700. He could not help it. With the record of J.Q. Adams fresh in the popular memory, his son and his only representative could not make terms with the slave power. And the slave power overshadowed all the great Boston interests. No doubt, Mr. Adams had principles of his own as well as inherited. But even his children, who as yet had no principles, could equally little follow the lead of Mr. Webster or even of Mr. Seward. They would have lost in consideration more than they would have gained in patronage. They were anti-slavery by birth, as their name was Adams, and their home was Quincy. No matter how much they had wished to enter State Street, they felt that State Street never would trust them, or they it. Had State Street been paradise, they must hunger for it in vain, and it hardly needed Daniel Webster to act as archangel with the flaming sword, to order them away from the door. Time and experience, which alter all perspectives, altered this among the rest, and taught the boy gentler judgment. But even when only 10 years old, his face was already fixed, and his heart was stone against State Street. His education was warped beyond recovery in the direction of Puritan politics. Between him and his patriot grandfather, at the same age, the conditions had changed little. The year 1848 was like enough to the year 1776 to make a fair parallel. The parallel, as concerned bias of education, was complete when, a few months after the death of John Quincy Adams, a convention of anti-slavery delegates met at Buffalo to organize a new party and named candidates for the general election in November. For president, Martin Van Buren, for Vice President Charles Francis Adams. For any American boy, the fact that his father was running for office would have dwarfed, for the time, every other excitement. But even apart from personal bias, the year 1848 for a boy's road through life was decisive for 20 years to come. There was never a side path of escape. The stamp of 1848 was almost as indelible as the stamp of 1776. But in the 18th or any earlier century, the stamp mattered less because it was standard, and everyone bore it, while men whose lives were to fall in the generation between 1865 and 1900 had, first of all, to get rid of it, and take the stamp that belonged to their time. This was their education. To outsiders, immigrants, adventurers, it was easy, but the old Puritan nature rebelled against change. The reason it gave was forcible. The Puritan thought his thought higher and his moral standards better than those of his successors. So they were. He could not be convinced that moral standards had nothing to do with it and that utilitarian morality was good enough for him, as it was for the graceless. Nature had given to the boy Henry a character that, in any previous century, would have led him to the church. He inherited dogma and, a priori, thought from the beginning of time, and he scarcely needed a violent reaction like anti-slavery politics to sweep him back into Puritanism with a violence as great as that of a religious war. Thus far, he had nothing to do with it. His education was chiefly inheritance, and during the next 5 or 6 years, his father alone counted for much. If he were to worry successfully through life's quicksands, he must depend chiefly on his father's pilotage. But for his father, the channel lay clear, while for himself an unknown ocean lay beyond. His father's business in life was to get past the dangers of the slave power, or to fix its bounds at least. The task done, he might be content to let his sons pay for the pilotage, and it mattered little to his success whether they paid it with their lives wasted on battlefields or in misdirected energies and lost opportunity. The generation that lived from 1840 to 1870 could do very well with the old forms of education. That which had its work to do between 1870 and 1900 needed something quite new.